The message really started last week. Those of you who were here with us in person or on Zoom probably heard me make a remark about Jesus' use of the word Father in the gospel text. And I said, I often find that I want to explain that because we are a church that's actually committed to just being upfront and real about the fact that we don't consider God to be male or female. That God is either both male and female or somehow neither or beyond gender categories or fluid, probably most accurately. And it's actually important to us. And then I thought, there's something that I haven't really talked about, and that is the Lord's Prayer, the prayer of Jesus. Because it's the only part in the liturgy every Sunday where we just use an exclusively male image, Father, our Father. And you all know the prayer. Now, so I just wanted to touch on that, and that got me thinking, and then you'll see where that led. But every Sunday, there's at least someone here for whom, like when I just said what I just said, you're thinking, what the heck is he talking about? I have never thought about God, male, female, or father, whatever. It's just, God, that's what I've heard, that's what I know, and I haven't really thought about it. So if that's who you are this morning, no problem. There are others who have thought about it and like it that way and don't want it to change. There aren't that many here, but there are people for whom it's a stretch, let's just say, to open up things like the gender of God, okay? And then there are others, quite a few of you, for whom our sensitivity to issues like this is part of why you're here. That you're looking for a church who will be upfront about things like this and talk about it. And so anyway, I have not obviously changed the word Father in that prayer. It was what I inherited, the form that you all were using. By the way, I have no idea why we say sins instead of debts or trespasses. That's the one point. Somebody will have to explain that to me at some point. We're the only church I know of that does that. And I really don't know. I just kept it as it was when I got here 3 years ago, almost. I also want to say that, I don't feel like it's my right to unilaterally just change these things because this is our church, not mine. And so if and when we change something significantly like this, we would talk about it. Right? I also know that there are many people for whom, as I said, the use of Father is meaningful, especially in this prayer, and that it doesn't feel like the Lord's Prayer if it's anything other than that. And theologically, I could push back against that, but emotionally and psychologically, I get that. And I want to be respectful of that and sensitive to that, and we need to meet each other where we are. There are other people I know who have said to me, that's the one part every week where I kind of have to bristle a little bit when I hear Father only. So we're diverse. And what I love about this congregation is that we will talk upfrontly. Upfrontly, is that a word? Straightforwardly about things like this. Okay. I also think it's important, personally, to be willing to have at least some part of our worship that goes all the way back historically and honors that tradition. And so for that reason, I have been reticent to suggest that we change it completely. It is kind of meaningful to me to know that people, ancestors, generations have been praying it that way for a long, long time. That has some meaning. And I know it has, heartstrings attached to know like your grandma prayed it that way or someone in Sunday school taught it that way. That's all good stuff. I also like the fact that there's at least something that all of us know by heart, no matter where you come from and in some tradition. And there was one Sunday in particular when the technology didn't work at all. I don't know if you remember that, but we had no screen and no bulletin or something. And so we just had to go with it. And when we got to that part, all of a sudden we all knew it and we could say it together. And that hit me, there's value in having something that we all know by heart and that's just in there. Okay, so periodically I add a more contemporary version of the prayer of Jesus as a way of just saying the real issue is let's look as deeply as possible at what the prayer means and work with all of that. Okay, so enough of all that. If you have strong feelings about any of these things, feel free to talk to me about it, okay? I'm really curious where you are, and I appreciate that we can just have all these things out there openly. But all this led me to maybe the primary reason why I wanted to mention this today, is that the reason we care at all and why we deal with things like the gender of God is that we are trying to be a church that's about justice and full inclusion. And that means with regard to gender and every other issue you could possibly think of. And these issues are connected to the problem of patriarchy. Patriarchy. Male domination. Systems that for millennia have privileged men over women, maleness over femaleness. And the church has been right in there with it, and in fact, undergirded many of the patriarchal norms. So we need, because of the dangers of patriarchy, as a justice issue, we have to deal with it. So as I was thinking about this, it took me to the biblical story of the book of Ruth. And Ruth Kemmerth, I'm glad to see you're here today. This is your namesake in the Bible. The book of Ruth. It's an amazing story. It's a horrifying story in some ways. It's a beautiful story in some ways, like so many of the Bible stories. And let me just put a plug in for our Bible study, Sundays, noon on Zoom. These are the kind of things that we would get into and talk about. So, the story of Ruth illustrates some of the dangers and the injustice of patriarchy. And by the way, if you're thinking, oh God, this is going to be boring, I don't care about patriarchy, hang in there. It'll get real in a minute. Maybe you don't know the story, so I'm going to tell it to you before I read the scripture text, a portion of it. So there was a man named Elimelech. You don't have to remember that. Elimelech. He was from Bethlehem, a Jewish man from Bethlehem. He had a wife named Naomi. There was a great famine in the land. And so trying to find a way to survive, they left their region because they couldn't make it there, and they went to the land of Moab, a foreign place. The land of Moab, they took Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons. While they were there, the 2 sons married 2 foreign Moabite women. Orpah was one of their names, and the other was Ruth. The famine swept through that land as well, and all the men died. Naomi's husband died. Both of her sons died, and so the 3 women were left. In that culture, the only way for a woman to survive, to be viable in society, was to be what they would call under the covering of a man. That was patriarchy. Women were actually regarded as property of the men. That's a problem. But that's how it was. And so Naomi and these 2 daughters-in-law were stuck, and Naomi, who was getting old, said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "You're still young. You've still got your looks. Go back where you came from and find a man. You can do it. It's over for me. I'm too old to find a man." The daughter-in-laws loved Naomi. They were heartbroken, and Orpah says, okay, I don't know what else to do, so she leaves. But the scripture today is one of the most well-known texts that highlights faithfulness and solidarity and commitment. And this is Ruth's response to her mother-in-law. It's Ruth chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return with your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, Naomi, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. And may the Lord do thus and so to me, and more, if even death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she became silent. So Naomi and Ruth went back to Bethlehem. When they got there, they were pretty ragged looking, as you might imagine. Looked like a couple of destitute refugees. It had been a long time since they'd been there, but some people recognized Naomi. They said, Naomi, is that you? What happened? And Naomi said, don't call me Naomi. The Hebrew word Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. Now, we'll let go of whether or not God had anything to do with the famine or her circumstances or what happened to her. As you often hear me say, that's another sermon. I mean, we all understand the tendency when something goes terribly wrong to think, man, what did I do to deserve this? Is God punishing me? Let go of that for now. But since we're looking at patriarchy, I just wanted to take a moment to say something about the name Almighty for God that Naomi used. You know what the Hebrew word is? El Shaddai. And scholars now have been more recently making a pretty significant thing out of the fact that the word El Shaddai, or the Hebrew words El Shaddai, could most appropriately be translated two different ways. One is God of the mountains, which is interesting. That would make God creation-centered, earth-centered, more akin to a Native American approach to spirituality, an earth-based God, not a sky God. The other, even more likely translation of El Shaddai is the breasted one. And all I want to say is I'm not sure how we got from the breasted one to Almighty, but I have a hunch it had something to do with the patriarchy of those who are doing the translating. Because it was too much in a patriarchal world even nowadays for a lot of people to handle. And all I can say is, I wonder how different the history of the world, but certainly the church and Judaism would be if we had embraced that name as well as some others for God. What different energy might we have worked with and welcomed if we imagined a God with breasts? And I know for some of you, it's probably just too much to even think about right now. I know. Well, I'll get back to Ruth in just a sec here, but I was at this event about 6 years ago, and I was asked to provide music for this conference that I was at, and it was at one of the UCC seminaries, and they were dealing with this subject, and the name El Shaddai and the breasted one, it came up, and a number of the scholars who were keynote speakers and very well-known feminist theologians and womanist theologians, and they were dealing with this, talking about its patriarchy that has gotten us the world that we now live with and taken us to the edge of destruction, how women have to be better, do better, work harder in order to be regarded. I mean, it all came up, right? And at the end of it, the president of the denomination was asked to wrap the thing up and to give an address at the very end. John Dorhauer. John's a heterosexual white guy about my age. And he gets up and he says, I've been listening closely, and I think I've gotten the message. God has breasts, and it's time for me to grow a pair. It was one of John's finest moments. So what's the rest of the story? Well, it's horrible in some ways and beautiful in others. I won't have time to say much about it, but here's what happened. Naomi had a distant relative. The Bible called him a man who was prominent and rich. His name was Boaz. He was older, and Boaz was a good man. Naomi told Ruth to go out in the fields of Boaz and to get behind the reapers at harvest time. The Jews had a custom that when you harvested, the reapers would go out and they would deliberately leave some of the crop in the field for the poorest of the poor to come and glean so that no one was completely destitute. Beautiful policy. So Ruth went out there and gleaned. And the Bible says that Boaz and all the other young men noticed Ruth. And Boaz asked about her situation and found out what she and Naomi had been through. So Boaz gave Ruth some extra food to take home to Naomi. And Ruth explained, Boaz was good to me today. And so here's what Naomi told her to do. Find out where Boaz sleeps. Go back there tonight about midnight. Wait until he's finished his eating and his drinking, and offer yourself to him. So Ruth did. I am so glad to say that Boaz did not take advantage of her. And if I had more time, a whole message could be right there, you know, about the extent to which vulnerable women, especially in a patriarchal society, are taken advantage of in so many different ways, including the obvious. But Boaz said no, and the next day he called together the community and his family, and he explained, Ruth and Naomi have come back. They're vulnerable. He didn't say anything about Ruth coming to him in the middle of the night. He said, is there anyone else here who can do the right of the next of kin? That was a reference to levirate marriage, a custom that was in their law and in their society, according to which if a woman lost her husband, the husband's next male of kin was required to take her in to have children with her so that the line of the family could continue. It's just the way it worked. And there was no one else who came forward, and so Boaz said, well, okay, then come and be with me. Which meant they were his property, and meant that he was obligated to have relations with Ruth. And sure enough, she became pregnant and had a son. The son was presented to Grandma Naomi to take care of. She loved him and nursed him, and when she gathered her friends around her, all the friends said, Naomi, you are blessed, and you are blessed because of your daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is more to you than 7 sons. In that context, that's saying a lot. That daughter-in-law of yours and her faithfulness is worth a whole heck of a lot of men. All right. 3 real quick points before we end. First, the story highlights the simple, powerful beauty of faithful women. And of women being faithful to each other. You know, there is just something about women with women. Female friendship. The love between a woman and a woman. There are times as a man I'm envious. Women, by nature of who you are as created by God, seem to know something about relationship that it's really hard for men to learn. Not impossible, but hard. So we celebrate that. And I take a moment and think about the faithful women you have known. And by faithful, I don't mean but they were all religious necessarily. But who loved you, loves you? What woman that you know has your back? So let's just let that sink in, how beautiful and powerful that is. And let's just take a moment to feel how powerful faithfulness, period, is. To know someone who would say to you, I will never leave you. No matter what, death itself will not part me from you. And I know how complicated relationships are. You know I know. And there are times when boundaries must be in place and times when relationships must end. But I'm talking about those blessed, beautiful moments in life when the relationship is such, maybe it's between you and your child, or you and your spouse if you're that blessed. Somebody that says to you and you to them, I got you. There's nothing more holy than that. Second, let's also let this story cause us to renew our commitment to dismantling patriarchy in all of its forms. In the name of the God of the Bible, El Shaddai, we commit ourselves to a world in which no one is marginalized or vulnerable or literally in danger simply because of some aspect of their core identity, gender, sexual orientation, race, whatever it is. And let's be honest. Patriarchy, male domination, and implied superiority of men over women, or cisgendered over bi, fluid, and trans, or the intersectionality of many of these factors is still rampant in our society. How many women have submitted research or papers or published books, the content of which only became popular and known and embraced when a man came along later on and published the same thing? It's still way too common. I have several female friends who at this moment are going through divorces or who have recently. And every one of them could tell us something about the fear and the vulnerability and the outright disrespect they've experienced in the process of ending a relationship with a husband who was by their mutual choosing the primary wage earner. My own mom, toward the end of her life, she was in a marriage that was not good. And I finally said to her, Mom, if you're this unhappy, why do you not end this? And she said, I'll tell you why. Because I need health insurance. And I can't get it with all my pre-existing conditions without him. And I'll be darned if I'm spending every cent that I've set aside in my life to pay for medical bills at this stage in the game. So we renew our commitment to the girls and to the women of our culture so that they know that this church and others like it are going to stand for justice and full inclusion for them. I want the girls and the children and the girls in particular who grow up with us to know that you do not need a man, quote, covering you, metaphorically, in any way to be fully who you were created by God to be. And you certainly don't need to give away or exchange in some transactional way the most precious parts of your being in order to survive. And if you're ever up against it, you come to us because we're your family and we will take you in. I'm emotional because I know, especially in Haiti, too many vulnerable girls. We'll save that. So finally, it's easy to miss that Ruth was not Jewish. A foreign woman who was an immigrant became one of the most significant women in the history of the Bible and of spiritual literature. And her son's name was Obed. And Obed grew up and had a son named Jesse. And Jesse grew up and had a son named David. That's where King David came from. All right, well, as we move toward communion, let me first say before I forget, our communion table is wide open. So if you're here for the very first time and you've never taken communion before in your life, you are welcome to join us with this. This is God's table, and these elements belong to all of us, and they're for you, whoever you are, whatever you believe or don't believe. But I also just wanted to point out as we move toward the table that Boaz, this benign patriarch, who, by the way, was a good guy, he honorably did what was the custom of his day. That doesn't make it right. The system was bad. But he did his best to be a good man in the midst of it and to treat these vulnerable women with respect. And you know who Boaz's mother was? Rahab, the prostitute, who hid the Hebrew spies. Remember the story? If you don't know it, another time. But I couldn't help but wonder if maybe part of why he grew up respecting women was that he knew what it was like to love a woman who was often not respected. It's worth thinking about. Last little point before we share the table. I wrote a children's song, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago. It hasn't been recorded. It's recorded. It hasn't been published really anywhere. But it's called Change the Rules. And I was trying to put all the stuff we've been alluding to this morning into something that would make sense to kids. So it said this. Here's the verse. I love the way that Jesus treated women. In his own man's world, he broke the boys' club rules. He taught that when a rule, even inside one's own religion, is unfair to all women, that rule is not true. Together, let's change the rules. Together then, all people, he, her, and them, let's change the rules.